We started part one of this lecture with this definition. Light, a range of frequencies of the electromagnetic spectrum which can be detected by the human eye. And I told you there were two problems with this, that we had to define human eye and we had to define electromagnetic spectrum. Well, we defined human eye in part one, so let's take a look at what electromagnetic spectrum is. Here's the spectrum. It goes from radio waves, microwaves, infrared waves, visible light, ultraviolet waves, X-rays, and gamma rays. The only difference between the waves of the electromagnetic spectrum is the wavelength and the frequency and the energy. Remember, wavelength is the size of the wave measured peak to peak, and frequency is the count or number of waves per second. As we move from right to left, we're going from radio waves to microwaves to infrared to visible light, and that's what the portion that we're interested in this unit, ultraviolet, X-rays, here and here, and gamma rays. Okay. The wavelength, up at the top, shown at the top, wavelength in meters, this is 10 to the 3, which would be 1,000, 100, 10, 1, 1/10, 100th, and so forth. You see at the top, and is illustrated by things that are similar sizes to it. For example, the radio waves are the size of soccer fields and houses down to the size of a baseball, and then at that point they become smaller. We transition to microwaves, and the wavelength of visible light is about the size of a bacteria. The ultraviolet are closer to viruses in size. By the way, this is why you can use light microscopes, like used in biology, to see things as small as bacteria. But you can't get any smaller than that with a light microscope, so viruses can't be seen by light microscopes. Frequency, down on this chart, down here at the bottom, starts very low at the radio wavelengths. It's waves 10 to the 6th. Notice then that we go up 10 to the 7th, 10 to the 8th, 10 to the 9th, 10 to the 10th, 10 to the 11th, 10 to the 12th, and so on. The frequency is getting higher. And it gets very high by the time we get to gamma rays. Energy is also following that same direction as frequency. It's getting higher. So it's 10 to the minus 9 to begin with, 10 to the minus 8. We get to 1. These are, by the way, these are electron volts, which is the unit of energy. 1 with about light, and then it increases up and up and up and up and gets higher. Notice that the low frequency waves do not harm us, but as the energy increases, they become more harmful. As you probably know, some portions of ultraviolet rays are harmful to you, and certainly X-rays and gamma rays are harmful. So anything beyond that point is harmful to living things. Here's a summary, a little more simplified. So wavelength, again, starts out long at the low end with the radio waves and goes to high, goes to shorter wavelengths down at the bottom. So low down here and shorter as we go this way. The frequency starts out low in number and gets higher, and energy follows the same direction as the frequency. Different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum can be broken down even further. These are radio waves and microwaves. We start out off on the left with what's called very low frequency, then low frequency, medium frequency, high frequency, very high frequency, ultra high frequency, super high frequency, and extreme high frequency. And your cell phones, by the way, are right about at 850 megahertz, which makes them in the ultra high frequency range. The wavelength and the frequency of visible light can be broken down into colors. And probably in middle school, you learned about Roy G. Biv as a way to memorize what order the colors come in. Humans can see with the frequency of 4.3 times 10 to the 14 hertz up to 7.5 times 10 to the 14 hertz. But as stated earlier, colors are usually given in wavelength, designated in wavelength, and we go from 400 short wavelength, short nanowaves, they're nanometers. Remember that means a billionth of a meter, all the way up to 700 nanometers. Note that red is the low frequency, but short wavelength end, and violet is at the high frequency, short wavelength end. You might be wondering about what electromagnetic waves are. And they are waves which can move through a vacuum because they're self-propagating, causing their own continuation. We'll talk about that in a second. They self-propagate by using changing electric fields, which generate changing magnetic fields, which generate changing electric fields, and so on and so on. These are using the principles of electromagnetism, which we learned in the last unit. Hopefully you're following the lesson in order, and before you got to this lecture, you did the reading on electromagnetic waves. Here's a possible conception by some artist, what they thought it might look like. Here's another diagram, visualization of what the wave might look like. Notice the wave is made up of a magnetic field and an electric field, which are separate but depend on each other. The magnetic field generates the electric field, and the electric field generates the magnetic field, and so forth and so on. Notice that the magnetic field and the electric field are perpendicular to each other, and they are also both perpendicular to their direction of travel. So they're traveling this way in the picture, and they're both perpendicular to that. Here's a little film that summarizes what we've been discussing up to this point and your reading, and previews our next step.
Light has long been a fascination of scientists, but it travels so fast that it was very difficult to study. Isaac Newton, the brilliant English physicist who lived in the 17th century, believed that light was made up of extremely small particles, but he could not explain how it traveled. Others believed that light was energy that traveled in waves, but they could not figure out how light waves could travel through space. By that time, quite a lot was known about sound, and it was felt that all energy needed a medium in which to travel. Scientists concluded that space had to be filled with some type of matter they called ether, which acted as the medium for light. In 1873, James Clerk Maxwell, a British physicist, resolved most of these problems. Maxwell developed equations based on the earlier work of Michael Faraday, who had demonstrated the link between electric fields and magnetic fields. The oscillations, or movements back and forth of electric charges, generate electromagnetic waves of energy, which propagate as transverse waves. Maxwell's calculations of the velocity of these waves match the speed of light, and led him to predict that light is an electromagnetic wave. Since electric and magnetic fields can exist in both a material substance and a vacuum, these waves do not require a medium and can travel through air, water, or the vacuum of space. Once that was understood, physicists abandoned the notion of ether. If we could see them, transverse waves would look something like the waves in this rope, or the ripples on the surface of a pond. This animation of an electromagnetic wave shows both the electrical and magnetic component of the wave. Note the two parts of the waves are at right angles to each other. Maxwell believed that electromagnetic waves were only energy, but it is now known that they are both waves of energy and particles called photons. This is called the wave-particle duality. All electromagnetic waves travel through space at the speed of light. Our greatest source of electromagnetic waves is the sun. But it is also the energy in radio and television waves, electric lights, the light emitted from fire, the atoms that make up matter, and much more. Electromagnetic waves are everywhere in our universe.
As they mention at the end of the film, is it a wave or a particle? They didn't mention this. Which is it? Well, the ancient Greeks did not agree. For instance, the Pythagoreans thought every visible object emitted a stream of particles, versus Aristotle, which thought light traveled in a manner similar to waves in an ocean. And then we get a little more modern, and we still have disagreement. We have Sir Isaac Newton and Christian Huygens, and they had two different proposals. Newton thought light must be made of particles. That's how it reflects, because if you imagine little particles bouncing off of things like a tennis ball bouncing off of a surface. Huygens thought light must be like a wave because it diffracts. Remember what diffraction was. Diffraction was waves, in this case traveling to the left. When they go through a small opening, they bend. Okay, that was diffraction. If there are two slits, here and here, and the waves come and each slit starts a new wave, and the two waves interfere with each other wherever they cross. Now we can see this happening in water waves. We can't see it with light waves. So for instance, if we have a light going through a slit, if that wave then diffracted, going through this slit, and then it went this way and went through these two slits and created two new waves, those waves would interfere with each other. We can't see any of this. We can't see anything here because we just can't see light waves, or anything here either. We can't see light waves. So what do? Well, if we put a screen, we can see the results. And we get this would be an interference pattern. How so? Well, if they didn't diffract and interfere with each other, we'd get, over on the left, we'd get this. The light would go through the two slits, and one would hit here, and one would hit here, and that's what we'd get. Now, if they diffracted, they would wind up interfering with each other, and we'd get the pattern you see over here. that would be caused by diffraction. And this is what happens when you actually do this. Here's a video clip illustrating the diffraction and interference of light.
What is light?
What is light? What is light? That's a good question, isn't it? What is light?
Isn't it an element?
Light is brightness, I guess.
We have auras.
We all have auras.
Which are light?
Yes, they are.
It lights up the room. It makes it not dark.
What's the difference between blue light and red light?
The colour.
It goes in your eyes and then you see stuff.
They range from white to red to orange to green. It's like the chakras of your body.
Can you see my aura?
No, not particularly right now.
Is it too bright out?
It's very sunny out here today.
Does that make it harder to see someone's aura?
Not necessarily.
If I was to explain it to a blind person, right,
Yeah.
it would be the difference. You see nothing whatsoever as a blind person, whereas I see things in front of me.
To be fair, the question of what light is not an easy one. For centuries, the greatest minds in science debated this issue. In the late 1600s, Newton proposed that light was a stream of particles, or corpuscles. He proposed this in his treatise Optics. But at the same time, a Dutch physicist named Huygens proposed that light was a wave. And this debate raged on until it was settled by the experiment I've recreated today, Thomas Young's double-slit experiment. To make sure I got the experiment right, I went to the original source. With the help of Brady Heron, I managed to get into the vault underneath the Royal Society in London. There I found Thomas Young's handwritten notes from 1803.
I brought into the sunbeam a slip of a card, about 1/30th of an inch
in breadth,
and observed its shadow, either on the wall or on other cards held at different distances. Besides the fringes of colors on each side of the shadow itself was divided by similar parallel fringes.
smaller dimensions. Wow.
This is an experiment so simple that you could make it at home, and yet so fiddly that I have never seen it before done with sunlight.
I was thinking about doing it in a box, like a fridge box.
And you could take it out on the street.
Taking it out on the street.
Could I possibly interview you guys for about a minute? We're doing a science experiment. I have here is an empty box. And this is a little eyepiece where we can look in, and this is a hole. And I'm gonna place this slide above that hole. And if you look closely, you'll see that there's two openings. Very narrow openings side by side. It's a double slit. Now before we have a look, we need to tilt it towards the sun a little bit. So we want the sun to hit this double slit directly. What are we gonna see on the bottom
Well,
of
the
the
obvious
box?
thing you think you're going to see is you're going to see two lines.
2 lines on the bottom of the box. 2 bright bands.
Two little lines.
Yeah.
I think it'll be one line instead of two.
I could expect to see the whole box lit up.
It'll probably be a kaleidoscope of some sort.
A bunch of colors.
Probably, yeah.
Rainbow, different colours.
There, have a look. You expected to see kind of one line. Is that what you see?
No.
I see dots.
How many?
It's one circle.
Well, there's one in the middle strongest, two either side.
The two on the outside are multicolored, and the one in the middle is just white.
And kind of a rainbow.
The rainbow of colour as well.
Quite a few colours and lots of little dots.
Like there are more dots appearing.
I think I can even see more dots spreading along. Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, I can see tons of dots now. Not tons, but I can see dots spreading across that way.
Either side.
Yeah, definitely.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, that's incredible. And that's just nothing else apart from
Two slits.
two slits. That's incredible.
But all we're doing is we're putting a light through two very narrow slits side by side. So how does this make any sense?
There's some kind of principle involved there that the average person is not familiar with. That's the only explanation.
No, I'm really confused by it, but I'd like to find out why.
People were debating, is light a wave or is it made of particles?
So what causes that?
Well, if light were behaving as particles, you would expect them to go through each slit and just produce a bright spot underneath. So we would see two bright spots on the bottom of the box. But if light's behaving as waves, then the wave from one slit can interact with the waves from the other slit. I've got a demonstration here on a little pond where we can see this with water waves. I have two sources of ripples, which are basically like the two slits. When I create ripples with a single source, they travel out with circular wavefronts. Nothing particularly surprising there. But If I add a second source of ripples, then we start getting an interesting pattern. This pattern is created by the ripples from the two sources interacting with each other. Where they meet up peaks with peaks and troughs with troughs, the amplitude of the wave is increased. That's what we call constructive interference. But if the peak from one wave meets up with the trough from the other, then we get destructive interference and there's basically no wave there. And this is exactly what was happening with the light. When the light from one slit met up peaks with peaks and troughs with troughs, they constructively interfered and produced a bright spot. But if the trough from the wave from one slit met up with the peak of the wave from the other slit, they would destructively interfere and you wouldn't see any light there. It's light cancelling itself out.
This is basically the same as like having 2 drops of water fall in a swimming pool.
That's right.
Get exactly the same
and then
pattern.
They go and overlap. As this ripple overlaps with those ripples,
Yeah.
down the bottom, you get a series of, you get like a bright spot, and then a dark spot, and then a bright spot, then a dark spot, then a bright spot. Now there's a slight complication, which is that sunlight is composed of many different colors, and they have different wavelengths. So obviously they're going to meet up at slightly different points. And that's what caused the rainbowing effects as we go further from the central maximum. You saw the ones to the right were slightly colored.
Yeah, it's
that's because
burgundy.
the reds are going to meet up at different places than the blues.
And that's all that makes the colour differences, is different wavelengths.
Exactly.
That's amazing.
So the difference between red
so
and blue,
that red bin over there and the green part is just, I'm seeing
It's a
that and
different-
it's just different
different
wavelengths. And that's how we bring in all these beautiful colours all around us.
Exactly.
That's amazing. I'm amazed. Oh, good on you. Thanks, Beck.
Hey, thank you.
I have been enlightened, literally.
Now you may have noticed in that experiment that the light on the bottom of the box was not in the shape of slits, rather they were more kind of round blobs. And I want to know why that is. Can you write an answer for me in the comment section? And I'll give you a hint. One of the videos I've linked kind of is suggestive of the answer. So convincing were the results of Young's double slit experiment that the scientific community concluded that light must be a wave. There is no way it could be a particle.
So everything is settled, right? No, not quite. Here's another video clip that may help a little bit.
You look down and see a yellow pencil lying on your desk. Your eyes, and then your brain, are collecting all sorts of information about the pencil. Its size, colour, shape, distance, and more. But how exactly does this happen? The ancient Greeks were the first to think more or less scientifically about what light is and how vision works. Some Greek philosophers, including Plato and Pythagoras, thought that light originated in our eyes and that vision happened when little invisible probes were sent to gather information about faraway objects. It took over 1,000 years before the Arab scientist Al-Hasan figured out that the old Greek theory of light couldn't be right. In Al-Hasan's picture, your eyes don't send out invisible intelligence-gathering probes. They simply collect the light that falls into them. Al-Hasan's theory accounts for a fact that the Greeks couldn't easily explain: why it gets dark sometimes. The idea is that very few objects actually emit their own light. The special light-emitting objects, like the sun or a light bulb, are known as sources of light. Most of the things we see, like that pencil on your desk, are simply reflecting light from a source, rather than producing their own. So, when you look at your pencil, the light that hits your eye actually originated at the sun and has travelled millions of miles across empty space before bouncing off the pencil and into your eye. Which is pretty cool when you think about it. But what exactly is the stuff that's emitted from the sun, and how do we see it? Is it a particle, like atoms? Or is it a wave, like ripples on the surface of a pond? Scientists in the modern era would spend a couple of 100 years figuring out the answer to this question. Isaac Newton was one of the earliest. Newton believed that light is made up of tiny, atom-like particles which he called corpuscles. Using this assumption, he was able to explain some properties of light, for example refraction, which is how a beam of light appears to bend as it passes from air into water. But in science, even geniuses sometimes get things wrong. In the 19th century, long after Newton died, scientists did a series of experiments that clearly showed that light can't be made up of tiny atom-like particles. For one thing, two beams of light that cross paths don't interact with each other at all. If light were made of tiny solid balls, then you would expect that some of the particles from beam A would crash into some of the particles from beam B. If that happened, the two particles involved in the collision would bounce off in random directions. But that doesn't happen. The beams of light pass right through each other, as you can check for yourself with two laser pointers and some chalk dust. For another thing, light makes interference patterns. Interference patterns are the complicated undulations that happen when two wave patterns occupy the same space. They can be seen when two objects disturb the surface of a still pond, and also when two point-like sources of light are placed near each other. Only waves make interference patterns, particles don't. And, as a bonus, understanding that light acts like a wave leads naturally to an explanation of what colour is, and why that pencil looks yellow. So, it's settled then, light is a wave, right? Not so fast. In the 20th century, scientists did experiments that appeared to show light acting like a particle. For instance, when you shine light on a metal, the light transfers its energy to the atoms in the metal in discrete packets, called quanta. But we can't just forget about properties like interference either, so these quanta of light aren't at all like the tiny hard spheres Newton imagined. This results that light sometimes behaves like a particle and sometimes behaves like a wave led to a revolutionary new physics theory called quantum mechanics. So, after all that, let's go back to the question, what is light? Well, light isn't really like anything we're used to dealing with in our everyday lives. Sometimes it behaves like a particle, and other times it behaves like a wave, but it isn't exactly like either.
We'll get to quantum mechanics later in this course.